Hi, everybody. In a somewhat buoyant and anarchic mood, uh, as Norm MacDonald would say, I don't know if any of you are history buffs. I want to talk about Nazism. We have a lot of Nazism, neo-Nazism, right? White supremacy. We have the problem in Finland right now. The government is in crisis because there was a quasi neo-Nazi in the government who had to resign over certain remarks. I think he said we should we should encourage abortion in Africa to deal with the climate crisis. I don't even want to consider what that means. There is a neo-Nazi movement in Greece. In Italy, you have the far right being normalized by Meloni. In France, you still have Marine Le Pen moving around on the edges, or more than the edges, the borders. In the United States, you have all the Trump people who are, certainly slavish and violent and stupid enough to be Nazis. And in Brazil, they fought off Bolsonaro and they've now been able to prohibit him from running until 2030. I'm sure there are many countries that, I haven't even covered yet, right? We have many of these problems. Vox here in Spain. But just to touch on one thing, the interesting thing is that there is an aspect of Nazism that is attractive to a certain kind of person. You'll notice that Nazism is attractive to certain fashion designers, like that guy, what's his name, who was at the House of Chanel, I guess, the brilliant designer who got into trouble when he got drunk and said all kinds of awful things to some Jewish women in a cafe in Paris. And there are others, there are obviously, campy kind of designers involved in the Nazi movement. If you look at, SS uniforms, there is definitely the dominatrix aspect of the long black coats and the peaked caps and the high boots and all of that, which is still attractive to a certain kind of person. All the goose stepping and all the order and all the saluting and all the disgusting, fruity uniforms and the death's heads and the runes and the style. It just goes on. And this is attractive to a certain kind of person who believes that it represents strength. So before you consider how strong you think it was and how Hitler, was somehow sort of a tragedy for having been a failure, aside from the fact that he was responsible for the murder of millions of innocents and would have, had he been successful in Europe, continued and decimated or annihilated the entire Slavic races of Russia and the Ukraine and Poland, right? Forget about all that. Consider this. What happened to Germany? How successful were the Nazis? Well, in December of 1941, Japan attacked the United States. December 7th, 1941. On December 8th, well, actually, I don't know if it was the 8th. I think it was the 8th that Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress. So 4 days after that, I don't know if it was the 11th or the 12th. I believe it was the 11th, 4 days after Pearl Harbor. Or maybe it was 4 days after Roosevelt's address to the Congress. Hitler, somewhat gratuitously, declared war on the United States. So that was a suicidal act with the intention of inviting absolute disaster. He expressed clearly his thought that if the Germans do not put up the sufficient fight to the death to defend themselves against the invading armies of the United States, of Great Britain, of Russia, then they deserve their fate. So he was an Austrian, he was not a German, he was not a patriot, but he invited disaster and absolute annihilation upon the German country, the German nation. That's the first thing. They lost the war. They not only lost the war, they perpetuated and executed total war, so they lost maximally until Berlin itself fell. The Russians entered and supposedly raped within 48 hours every woman in Berlin between the ages of 14 and 72. So, the absolute defeat and humiliation to the center of the capital of the German state, unnecessarily. He could have capitulated a year and a half before that. And there were years of terrible, barbaric saturation bombings of the city centers of all the great cities of Germany. So that the English, and I believe the Americans, but led by the English, Harris, the head of the Air Force, the Royal Air Force, destroyed the city centers of Cologne, of Dusseldorf, of Berlin, of Hamburg, of Dresden, the crown jewel of the medieval cities of Germany, and of other cities as well. I don't know whether they bombed Munich. I don't think they did. But I was in Cologne, and there is nothing in Cologne except the cathedral. The rest of Cologne, which was seriously damaged, the rest of Cologne is all built up since the 50s. It's ugly. It's lost. And I can only suppose that the same can be said of Dresden and Hamburg and Berlin, which I have not visited, but would very much like to. So this is what your Nazism gets you. Absolute defeat. Absolute destruction. The infamous murder of millions upon millions of innocent people, men, women, and children. The prostitution of the entire legal system and the social system and the bureaucracy to basically dip all hands in blood so that the entire nation is guilty. And total defeat. Well, that sounds like a great ideology to be a part of.